Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking you right to the front lines of one of the body's most intense, continuous battles. We're talking about the upper gastrointestinal tract.
It's basically a chemical warfare zone, day in and day out. Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the extreme lengths the body goes to just to protect itself.
Specifically in the esophagus and stomach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we'll look at what happens when those really sophisticated defenses are just completely overwhelmed. You're dealing with these highly acidic environments, layers of mucus shields.
And it seems like anything can tip the balance. Lifestyle, drugs, even our own immune system turning against us.
It can trigger a catastrophic failure.
We have some fascinating and honestly sometimes chilling source material here. We're going to start high up in the esophagus with a disease that's really defined by this insidious adaptation.
Esophageal squamous cell carcinoma.
Right. Then we'll drop down into the stomach, see how that protective shield can fail immediately, and then we'll get into this crucial medical duel. Two totally different types of chronic stomach inflammation that somehow end up in the same terrible place.
It's a journey that really just emphasizes the delicate balance required for survival in the GI tract. So let's start with the esophagus, SCC. This is a disease where the timeline, that gap between onset and diagnosis, is the real tragedy.
And that tragedy is rooted in just how sneaky the symptoms are. We see patients typically showing up with dysphagia, that's difficulty swallowing.
Or a dinophagia, which is actual pain when swallowing.
But here's the point, the critical point that makes it so challenging. Patients don't just suddenly feel this massive blockage. They unknowingly adjust their entire diet.
They do. You stop eating steak, then you move to, soft chicken and fish. Then maybe it's mashed potatoes. And pretty soon you're only having soups and liquids.
So the patient is adapting to the mechanical obstruction.
Yes. They are masking the disease's progression until the blockage is severe. And by then, the tumor is often already quite advanced.
And that biological capacity to adapt is why the prognosis disparity is just so massive. Our sources highlight that if you catch the superficial lesions, the earliest stages,
then the 5-year survival rate is excellent. It's around 75%. That's a very treatable disease.
But the reality is that the overall 5-year survival rate across the United States is, what, less than 20%?
It is. And that staggering drop is precisely because most people only get help when their ability to adapt finally runs out and swallowing becomes almost impossible. So early detection is everything.
So what's driving this? In places like the US and Europe, what's fueling this cancer?
It's largely a story of lifestyle synergy. The combination of chronic alcohol use and tobacco smoking, they work synergistically.
Meaning the combined risk is way worse than just adding the two risks together.
Far greater. They're both powerful irritants constantly damaging the esophageal lining, which then forces this continuous and often flawed repair process.
But it's important to remember, this isn't the story everywhere. Not all SCC globally is driven by that classic synergy. Our sources note that in high-risk regions in, say, Asia or parts of Africa, where alcohol and tobacco are less common.
Right. There, you see different factors dominating. It's often linked to things like specific nutritional deficiencies.
Or environmental toxins.
Exactly. Mutagenic compounds like nitrosamines and polycyclic hydrocarbons, which you can find in foods that have been contaminated by certain fungi. It's a powerful reminder that your cancer risk is highly customized by your specific environment.
Okay, let's shift just a bit. If we look at the molecular profile, what are the key genetic changes that let these cells go rogue?
You basically see the body hitting the accelerator and cutting the brakes at the same time. We often see amplification of the SOX2 transcription factor gene.
And that's a regulator for stem cells, right?
It's a master regulator of stem cell self-renewal. So when you amplify that, you're just hitting the gas pedal on cell growth hard.
So what about the brakes?
That's where you get these loss-of-function mutations in crucial tumor suppressor genes, like TP53 and NOTCH1. These are the body's internal guardians, and when you disable them, the cell loses its ability to spot damage or stop dividing when it shouldn't.
And that's when the cancer can really thrive. So physically, where does this disease tend to settle in?
Well, squamous cell carcinoma, unlike adenocarcinoma, which is more distal, tends to favor the midsection. About half of SCCs happen in the middle third of the esophagus.
And because the esophagus has that rich lymphatic network,
it becomes a highway for cancer cells to escape.
So the metastasis pattern is predictable based on the tumor's initial zip code, so to speak.
Precisely. If the tumor starts in the upper third, the cells drain into the cervical lymph nodes. If it's the middle third, they're heading to the mediastinal nodes around the heart and lungs.
And the lower third.
They spread downward toward the gastric and celiac nodes. The location really dictates the primary escape route.
A really tough, complex disease. Let's move from the esophagus down into the stomach now, where the fight is less about that insidious adaptation and more about the immediate breakdown of this high-tech protective shield.
It really highlights the incredible challenge of the stomach. I mean, we're talking about an internal environment, the lumen, that has a pH close to 1.
To put that in perspective, that's over 1,000,000 times more acidic than your blood.
It's strong enough to dissolve metal. Yet somehow the stomach lining survives this continuous, catastrophic chemical assault for years and years.
So how does the body build a defense strong enough to hold that back?
It's a masterpiece of biological engineering. It relies on 4 highly coordinated layers, mostly generated by what are called the foveolar cells. So layer 1 is the physical barrier.
The heavy armor plating.
You could call it that. A thin but continuous layer of dense mucus and surface phospholipids.
But that can't be enough on its own.
It's not, because acid could still diffuse through. So layer 2 is genius. The cells constantly secrete bicarbonate into that mucus layer. This creates a tiny millimeters thin layer of fluid right next to the cells. We call it the unstirred layer that maintains a neutral pH of 7.
So the acid stops at the mucus, and the mucus itself has this neutralizing force field running through it, protecting the cells underneath.
Exactly right. Then layer 3 is the epithelial cells themselves. They're tightly joined, forming the final physical barrier that actively limits any remaining back diffusion of that destructive acid.
And layer 4. This seems to be the one that keeps the whole system powered up.
This is the crucial regulatory system. It's run by local hormones, specifically prostaglandins E2 and I2. These prostaglandins are the maintenance crew. They ensure robust blood flow, they stimulate mucus production, and they drive that critical bicarbonate secretion.
They're the energy source and the central command.
They really are.
Okay, so we know the 4 layers. Let's look at the main way we see this entire defense grid fail acutely. And that is, ironically, by taking a medication we think is helping us.
NSAID-induced injury, or gastropathy. This is a classic case of collateral damage. NSAIDs, like ibuprofen or aspirin, work by inhibiting an enzyme called cyclooxygenase, or COX.
Which is involved in inflammation.
Right. But by doing that, they also inadvertently inhibit the COX-dependent synthesis of those absolutely critical protective prostaglandins, E2 and I2.
So if prostaglandins are the maintenance crew and the power supply, taking an NSAI is like cutting the power to the entire defensive shield.
That's a great analogy. You're not just irritating the lining, you are actively dismantling the protection. The sources confirm when you stop producing those prostaglandins, you break down all 4 defense mechanisms at once.
All at once.
All at once. The mucus thins, bicarbonate secretion stops, blood flow reduces, and the epithelial cells become permeable. It's a systemic failure.
And is there a distinction between the types of NSAIDs, like the newer ones?
There is, but it's a small one. While the original COX-1 pathway was the major culprit, we now know that even the newer, more selective COX-2 inhibitors still carry a significant risk. The system is just too interdependent to safely target only one enzyme.
That's failure point 1, a direct chemical attack. Failure point 2 is stress-related mucosal disease, or SRMD. This happens when the body is already in crisis.
Yes, you see this in critical care patients. Severe trauma, major surgery, extensive burns, sepsis, serious intracranial disease. The key driver here isn't chemistry, it's blood flow. The primary issue is local ischemia.
Meaning the blood vessels supplying the stomach just constrict.
They constrict or the patient's blood pressure drops. Without that rich mucosal blood flow, the oxygen supply collapses, the tissue becomes vulnerable, and it's easy for the acid, even normal amounts of it, to just breach the defenses.
And our sources give these really striking specific names for these ulcers.
They do. The clinical history is written right in the name. You have curling ulcers, which are ulcers in the proximal duodenum, specifically in patients with severe burns or massive trauma.
And then there were the Cushing ulcers, which are linked to intracranial disease. Why is that specific association so important?
The Cushing ulcers are the most dangerous. They carry a much higher risk of perforation. And unlike most SRMD, which is caused by low blood flow, Cushing ulcers are linked to direct stimulation of the vagal nerve from the brainstem.
And that stimulation causes
Massive hypersecretion of gastric acid.
Wow. So most stress ulcers are from low blood flow, making the stomach weak. But a Cushing ulcer is a terrifying double whammy. Low blood flow and super high acid levels.
Precisely. That dual mechanism, weakened defenses meeting an aggressive acid surge, is why they're so much more likely to perforate the stomach wall.
Incredible. Okay, so we've covered acute failure. Let's shift to chronic inflammation, where the battle is slow, persistent, and the immune system is involved.
Yeah.
This is the tale of two drivers.
Right. Chronic gastritis has those frustrating, persistent symptoms, nausea, chronic pain, and it's driven by two completely different things. The incredibly common H. pylori infection and the much rarer autoimmune atrophic gastritis.
Let's start with the global heavyweight, Helicobacter pylori.
It is by far the most common cause of chronic gastritis worldwide. The good news is that better sanitation has really reduced how common it is in younger people, but it's still pervasive in older populations, up to 50% in the over 65 crowd in the US,
And it's usually picked up in childhood.
often through fecal-oral transmission, and it can just persist for life.
So how does this tiny spiral-shaped bacteria manage to live permanently in a pH-1 stomach?
It's an adaptation genius. First, it uses its flagella to motor through the thick mucus, but its real secret weapon is an enzyme called urease. Urease converts urea into ammonia.
And ammonia is alkaline.
Highly alkaline. It creates a little self-made neutral zone right around the bacterium, a protective bubble of pH 7, letting it survive right on the surface of the acid barrier.
And its danger level depends on its genetics.
Very much so. The sources really highlight this one gene, the cytotoxin-associated gene A, or CAGA. This is critical because 90% of the bacterial isolates linked to a high prevalence of gastric cancer carry this gene.
What does that toxin actually do?
CAG gets injected directly into the gastric cells, where it hijacks their internal signaling. It's a biochemical disruptor that tells the cell to behave badly, which is one of the first major steps toward cancer.
Okay, now we have to talk about the progression dilemma. This paradox of one bug leading to two completely opposite outcomes.
It's all about location, location, location. If the infection stays mostly in the antrum, the lower part of the stomach, it often leads to increased acid production,
More acid, which leads to...
a higher risk of duodenal ulcers. But if that long-standing infection spreads up into the body and fundus, the main acid-producing areas, the inflammation causes massive cell death and atrophy.
So you lose the acid-producing cells.
And that leads to reduced acid secretion. Low acid, or acylhydria, creates an environment that's ripe for gastric adenocarcinoma and a specific cancer called myeloid lymphoma.
So the same bug can flip a switch that takes a stomach from a hyperdefensive, ulcer-prone state to an atrophic, cancer-prone state. It just depends on where the inflammation settles.
Now, contrast that complex scenario with our second driver, autoimmune atrophic gastritis. This isn't an external enemy. This is the immune system turning on itself.
And it strikes in a different place than H. pylori.
It does. It typically spares the antrum and focuses its attack on the body and fundus, where the specialized parietal cells live. The mechanism involves CD4 plus T cells attacking the proton pump.
The proton pump, that's the actual molecular machine that makes the acid. So the immune system is actively shutting down the acid factory.
It is, and the key thing here is that the antibodies against these parietal cells and against a protein called intrinsic factor, they can be detected in the blood decades before a patient ever shows a single symptom. The attack is slow and relentless.
And losing parietal cells has huge consequences because they make two critical things, acid and intrinsic factor.
Right. Losing the acid leads to acylhydria. Losing intrinsic factor is equally critical because it means you can no longer absorb vitamin B12.
Which is the definition of pernicious anemia.
It is. And that B12 deficiency doesn't just cause anemia, it causes things like atrophic glossitis, that smooth, beefy red tongue, and potentially irreversible neurological damage. It's also often linked with other autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes or Hashimoto's.
Let's just zoom out and lock in the core differences here. This is the medical fingerprint that really sticks with you.
We can connect the dots with 3 key points. First, location. H. pylori starts in the antrum. Autoimmune is focused on the body from the start.
Second, acid production. H. pylori can mean high or normal acid. Autoimmune gastritis means markedly decreased acid acylhydria.
And third, the long-term sequelae. Both can lead to adenocarcinoma, but H. pylori also causes ulcers and multi-lymphoma. Autoimmune gastritis specifically leads to pernicious anemia and carcinoid tumors.
It's just fascinating that two completely different drivers can cause inflammation in different places, manipulate acid in opposite ways, yet both paths can end up destroying the gastric lining and increasing cancer risk.
It really stands out. The severity of the disease is determined not just by the threat, but by the host's specific inflammatory response and, crucially, where that response takes place.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've traced the grim path of esophageal cancer, the acute failure of the stomach's defenses, and finally, these two chronic opposing pathways to disease in the stomach.
And we noted the success story of public health. Better sanitation has significantly cut H. pylori rates in younger people. It highlights how critical the childhood environment is for preventing lifelong disease.
So we've learned a lot about the fragility of the upper GI tract. What's the final thought we should leave everyone with today?
I think you should reflect on the paradox we uncovered with H. pylori. Think about one single tiny infectious agent that has evolved such molecular sophistication that, depending on your specific genes and immune factors, it can dictate whether your stomach spends the next 30 years in a state of high acid aggression or low acid cancer's atrophy. That complex negotiation between bug, host, and environment dictates life-altering pathology, showing us that disease is less a single event and more a constantly shifting internal landscape.